This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 289 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's called Behind the Scenes in Travel Media and Public Relations. Before I get into this juicy topic, I want to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm recording this podcast today, but also the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land we know as Sydney, because much of this episode is about my recent work trip to Australia's delightful largest city. Incidentally, when I was just triple checking that Sydney still has the largest population, I did learn that it's projected that Melbourne will have the larger population again. It has, in the historical past, had the larger population, but it's apparently going to catch up and exceed Sydney within the next decade. So there you go. Both wonderful cities. But in this case, and for the purposes of this episode, I spent most of a week last month in Sydney. So my trip there was prompted by the annual IMM. It's the International Media Marketplace event. But when I was kind of planning my usual trip report post-Sydney, I realised that talking about this trip could be kind of an interesting chance to lift the curtain on some of the behind-the-scenes aspects of media and public relations in the travel and tourism industry. I know that many of you are frequent, or at least frequent daydreaming travellers, but you work in completely different fields, so I thought it might be of interest to explain how some of this behind-the-scenes stuff works. So today's episode is a bit about me from my experiences in gorgeous Sydney, and then a chat I recorded with a friend who works in public relations in the travel space, who can give you even more insider knowledge and kind of from the other side. So, looking back at my time in Sydney, whenever I do a trip report episode, I generally go to my photo albums, my digital photo albums, obviously. But I know this one was a particularly busy trip because when I went to check, I noticed that I had taken hardly any photos. It was one of those on-the-go trips. Now, you know that I do always try to adopt kind of slow travel principles as much as possible and stay longer whenever I can. So I added an extra day or so at either end, which was really just spent catching up with friends. I mean, not just. Time with friends is super important, especially when they live on the other side of the country. So a day or two of friend stuff, and then I had 3 days basically of work in the middle of that trip. I mean, work in the, glorious sense of some things were absolutely delightful things to do, but still work. So on one of these days, for example, I was invited to a tourism industry lunch. In fact, this one was hosted by Journey Beyond Rail, who operate all the fabulous long-distance trains in Australia, like the Indian Pacific. It heads east out of Perth. This kind of industry lunch happens relatively rarely in Perth, unfortunately, because we are far away and a smaller population, but they're very common, of course, in larger cities like Sydney or Melbourne. So that was a good opportunity to see more about what Journey Beyond are doing at the moment and do some train travel daydreaming while I was at it and have a lovely meal with some lovely people. Now, the second day was when the work really heated up, I suppose. It was the pre-IMM Day Summit put on by Trav Media. So basically, this is what many of you would consider a conference. It was a bunch of panels and speakers for the day. And of course, very importantly, lots of morning tea and lunch networking and catching up with travel media friends who I don't get to see often enough. And I had breakfast twice with the fabulous Julie Jones of Have Wheelchair Will Travel, very important friend to catch up with. That was very special. Hadn't seen enough of her in recent years. And yeah, so lots of very cool networking and friend catch-ups. Also, public relations people are part of this day. And so some of the panels were more slanted towards their interests, others more to media like me. Not much for podcasters, mostly for writers. But I was very pleased that a lot of the day's questions mentioned podcasts. So podcasts are getting up there. I was also really pleased that issues I consider really important, like accessible travel, LGBTQIA plus travel, Indigenous travel, sustainability, and those sorts of things were mentioned much more frequently. So, all of those thoughtful travel topics. I think we still have a long way to go to have those kind of topics really kind of embedded in people's discussions and decisions about travel and tourism, but at least they're not ignored completely anymore. So this is progress. So my third working day was really the whole crux of the trip was IMM itself, International Media Marketplace. Sounds very grand. It's basically a professional speed dating event, I guess is the best way to describe it. So on the one hand, there are the public relations people, tourism boards, hotels, etc. And on the other side are travel media, so writers, content creators, the occasional podcaster, well, me. And so after we submitted our preferences, so from both parties, we all submitted our preferences for meetings online, a few weeks prior, and then a timetable is created and we end up with, 15 to 20 meetings, 15 minutes each throughout the day. So the purpose of those meetings is to see ways that the two parties might be able to work together. So in my case, for me as a podcaster, this is actually a multitude of things. So it might be that they talk about hosting me on a trip. It might be talk of a sponsorship deal. It might be that they can provide some great guests for the podcast or a combination of all of those things. So it is exhausting, but extremely useful. Of course, every evening also brought with it a networking event or two and some time after for meals and drinks. And, these often they're the most important part of these kinds of work trips. I caught up with lots of great friends, also many past guests of the podcast, a few of whom I'd actually never met in person before. So that was incredible fun. I, of course, have also met a few new people who hopefully will be future guests too. So that was very special. I also did manage to have a bit of Sydney downtime, a bit of relaxation time, and I got to stay with a well-known friend of the podcast, Catherine, who also actually took me out on the harbour on a local ferry on our way home, the perfect scenic route. And that's when I always think, Sydney is amazing. I could sail past the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House a million times and still be amazed. I don't know if it's because, when you grow up on the other side of the country, that, Sydney has these absolutely iconic sites. And, when you don't see them very often, it's just, I don't know, it's just amazing. It's just very beautiful. It was also the start of World Pride in Sydney. So everywhere we went, the city was basically decorated all over with rainbows, and there was just such a joyous atmosphere out in the evenings. It was a really, really lovely time to be there. Unfortunately, that meant it was a very busy time and accommodation was crazy, but it was worth it. It was a really, really special time to be in Sydney. So, all in all, a fantastic trip. I wish I could have stayed longer, but unfortunately another work trip awaited, which I will talk about next week. I wanted to do the behind the scenes from the other side. So I was chatting with my friend Christina Koullas from CKPR, it's her own PR agency, and I thought that it would be very useful to ask Christina to give us an overview of public relations in this industry. So she's based in Melbourne, works with lots of different clients, but especially works in tourism and travel. So I asked her basically to start off with what's PR and how does it work? So here's our behind the scenes special.
I thought it would be good to start with what is public relations. So when I was at university, we were taught it was being the messaging between an organisation and its publics or its audiences. But obviously that was 20 plus years ago and things have definitely evolved since then. Back then it was about, securing a story in a newspaper or the radio or TV. And now we've evolved with so many communications channels out there. Case in point, I'm currently on a podcast. Obviously social media is a huge thing and there are so many other aspects to public relations now, and travel PR, I think, is the most fun.
I can imagine.
Yes, like all PR, it's very intense, but it's so rewarding. And I think, travel journalists will tell you the same thing. We don't necessarily do it because we're making millions of dollars, but we do it because we're so passionate about it, about the space and what we do, and we really live it. So I thought I would start with the process for new clients. So first of all, we get to know them well. There's so much competition out there. So what are their points of difference and who do they want to speak with and who their target audiences are. So we have some clients that want to speak to leisure travellers and consumers. So it's a majority of them. Then we have the ones who cross over into both sides. So hotels will often want to speak to both business travellers and consumers and age groups. Like, you know, for some audiences, TikTok is great. For others, you want to be focusing on LinkedIn. So yes, channels are really important as well. You know, which podcasts do we go out to? Which content creators or influencers? I prefer to use content creators because there's so much more to influencers than what people know. So blogs and creating that, you know, exceptional photos and videos and telling a story. And then also other strategies such as live activations, live promotions, thinking outside of the box. Then it's about what key messages we want to weave into. Just having 3 or 4 key messages that you want to get out there that's really important about your brand or your product that you will weave into everything. Like if I'm doing a podcast, then I want to be coming back to those key messages.
Can you give us an example of key messages?
For example, this property has exceptional, unparalleled views. Like, it sounds simple, but that might be part of what makes your product special. Or
so that's something you keep coming back to.
That's right.
Or represent in different ways and places.
That's right. Yeah. Or this is a sustainable property, like these are the sustainability features. So what are the stories we can tell as well with that brand? A lot of what media and content creation is about these days is that storytelling, because there's so much content out there, we're all hearing a lot of the same things. So what's the story behind your brand and what's the human interest story? So sometimes the people behind that brand can be really interesting and offer something that no competitor is offering. Talk about the dinner party test. So what's a story about that brand I can put to a dinner party, and what would make people get really excited and what would make their eyes glaze over? And then what's topical right now? So how is our client relevant to those topical issues out there? So is it sustainable travel? Is it travel on a budget now that the cost of living is such a big thing in Australia? Is it wellness travel post-pandemic? So how does that relate to my brand? And then also looking at, because journalists work on a lot of roundup stories. So, for example, if there's best rooftop bars, then is that something my client or product would be relevant for? Is it best pools? I'm going to mention sustainability a lot, but, you know, is it the most sustainable?
Perfect.
Yeah.
No, I love it.
Is it the most sustainable hotels? So what are some key features or some key selling points that might work in with some of those roundup articles? So the brand's not necessarily the star of that story, but they're part of it for someone who's looking for the best restaurants in Melbourne, for example. Yeah, and then thinking about what you can do that's outside the box and is memorable. But then also, so you can do some really cool stunts, and we see the bigger brands doing that, but will the time and money invested be worth the return? So at CKPR, we're always trying to make sure that, you know, we make every dollar go as far as we can for the client. So we can do something that we think will maybe make the television news, or it could get onto Sunrise, but then we also have to think, well, is Sunrise, for example, the right outlet for our audience? Yes, it might have big reach, and yes, and for some audiences it is great, but we need to think about, is that worth, because sometimes there's production fees as well. Is it all worth the time and money? Sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no.
How do you measure PR? So, you know, when I work with like social media clients and they do Facebook advertising, you can measure, okay, this many people clicked on the ad and this many people booked and we earned this much money from the bookings. But PR is like less measurable, I guess.
That's right. And that's a really interesting one because it can be really contentious, because old school PR was to take the advertising value of an article and then multiply it by an arbitrary number such as 2 or 3, because PR was seen as more valuable than advertising, because when you think about it, a journalist is an influencer. Like that is seen as a third-party endorsement. So that used to be the way it was measured, and then people would say, you know, I did this campaign and I generated $25 million worth of coverage, and sometimes you still see that, and sometimes the client will request it, but it's time consuming and it is an inexact art, especially with online media now as well. So some good ways to measure it is if your client got good access to their Google Analytics and looking at the coverage we've generated and how that's married up with a spike in their bookings or a spike in visitation to their website can be a good way to measure it. Also, we will agree with a client as to what their top media list is, or their top outlets, or what do they really want to get into. So that can be a way to measure it as well. An increase, if there's a social element to what you're doing, an increase in social followers can be a way to measure it as well. So there's some more measurable ways you can do it, but we do like to have objectives in our initial PR plans, and then how we're going to measure that so we can actually go back and say, yes, we did achieve that. And sometimes if it's a hotel, they will say, like, we want this many bookings or accommodation nights, and you don't have control over everything, but you are playing a part to securing those.
So then I actually asked Christina to describe the process from the PR perspective of working with a journalist. So basically how stories are published. One interesting point to note here, I've learnt from Facebook groups and chats that this system actually differs from place to place. So here in Australia, for example, it's most common for a journalist to have what they'd call a confirmed commission. So basically a promise from a newspaper or magazine to take a story about a particular trip. This confirmation comes before the trip is taken. But in the US, for example, this is completely unheard of. Journalists will be taken on a trip kind of just on good faith that they will later find a market for their story. So I've always guessed, I actually don't know for sure, that the size of the markets have something to do with this, but I actually don't know. But anyway, something to bear in mind as you listen to Christina's explanation of the Australian situation.
It can be a media famil, for example, or which is short for familiarisation. So we might know of a journalist who we like or who we've worked with before. Then we'll talk to them about whether there's an interest in the destination or the product. We'll look at, for example, what does that journalist specialise in? Like, do they like caravanning, or do they like family travel, and what's that part of the product that suits that audience? So, we're trying to work mutually. So for them, their interest is to secure stories because that's how they make their income. And of course, for us, it's about getting our brand out there. But once we've agreed, yes, we want to go ahead with the trip, then it's about how much support we can provide. So working with, we'd like to try and make it as economical as possible for the journalist. So we won't always have the budget for flights, but if we can, working with the state tourism body. And then it's about coming up with an itinerary, again, that works for the journalist, allowing enough time for the journalist to find their own stories. So a lot of what we do is individual media famils, but if it's doing group famils, making sure everyone's not doing the same thing and that they can, it's in everyone's interest for the journalist to find their own interesting angles.
Otherwise you get 5 same stories coming out of...
Exactly. And being, pitched to the same outlets saying, well, no, we've got this story.
Yeah.
And touching base with the journalist during their trip as to how things are going. And then once they're back, can we support them with any imagery that they might not already have? And is there anything they need to check, fact checking? What's the latest lead-in price? What's the website? Has anything changed since then?
If you're curious to know a bit more, actually, Christina has a great blog post on her website called How We Secured a Cover Story for a Client in a National Publication, which actually details a scenario a few years back when she and the aforementioned Catherine worked together. And I'll link in the show notes both to Christina's blog post and the resulting story that Catherine wrote for the Asian Sydney Morning Herald's publication Traveller. It's an interesting kind of both sides to it. So, hopefully this has been of interest and you have some new insights into how this all works if you are not from the travel industry. I certainly have learnt a lot from these people over the last few years because I just came into it as almost a blind podcaster. I had done freelance magazine writing back in the past, kind of mostly 15 years ago. I still dabble in it, but it's certainly not one of my main income sources. And so there's a lot that I don't know. So I find it all really interesting, and I hope you did too. And above all, my time in Sydney was very, very worthwhile. Every trip's great, right? Anyway, thank you so much for listening to episode 289 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Big thanks to Christina for chatting with me. You can find more details about Christina at ckpr.com.au. And as promised, I'll leave a link in the show notes to those two, the blog post and Catherine's story. Don't forget to come and chat with us, the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers or the LinkedIn group for Thoughtful Travellers. Just search in either of those platforms and you should find us, or you can click on the link in the show notes. And for this episode, the show notes will be at notaballerina.com/289. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.